Hi everyone, this is Srivatsa from Informatica Global Customer Support. Today I will be making a short video presentation on BCI framework, which is Business Content Integration. It's one of the components of Power Exchange for SAP NetWeaver. So we would have an overview of Business Content Integration, and we will see how scheduling works in BCI. We'll see how different transfer methods work, and then we will go over the functionalities that have been added to the BCI of late. So let's see how the BCI framework works. So it starts off with a send request to the SAP system for a data source extraction. And SAP passes on the data to the listener workflow. The listener workflow populates the staging area, which is the source for BCA table. And once the population of source for BCA table is complete, it triggers a processing workflow. The processing workflow processes the data from the staging area and then reports back the status to the listener. And listener workflow following that kicks off the send request workflow for the next data source. There is a cleanup session that is configured with every processing workflow. So every time the processing is done for a particular data source, it cleans it up. But you could have this cleanup session later where you clean up the source of BCI table after you have done the data extraction for all data sources. Now let's look at the mapping, how they are configured for this and the workflow configuration for this. So here's my listener mapping. It has an application source qualifier and it has 4 targets. So the source for BCI, as I mentioned, is the staging area. Then it has the scheduling target, which actually does the scheduling for different data sources. So it goes through a cycle of send request, pick up the processing mapping, do the send request for the next data source, and pick up the processing mapping for the data source. Like that, it goes in a cycle. So let's take a look at the scheduling target. Scheduling target has the name of the indicator table. The indicator table is populated by the Power Center after extracting all the data and populating the source for BCA table. The indicator table has the request ID name for the data source. The request ID is generated by the send request workflow for the data source. Then, apart from the request ID, it has the data source name and the status for the processing mapping run. So the way to schedule is you kick off the send request workflow for the first data source. The first data source is the key here. Followed by that, there is a processing mapping, which processes the data source data. Then there is the secondary workflow name, where you have the workflow of the send request for the next data source. So the entire process starts off with the send request for the first data source. Then everything else happens automatically. So it goes to the first data source, and it kicks out the processing workflow for the first data source, and it sends the send request for the next data source until it encounters a column where there is no more send request workflow to trigger. So now I have the processing mapping. The processing mapping reads from the source for BCA table. As I had mentioned earlier, source for BCA stores the control record, the actual IDOC record, and the segment record. And the control record table is meant for storing the control record segment. Then you have the actual data source extracted data that goes into the data warehouse. Then you have the document number. It stores the maximum document number. Every packet has a different document number generated for it in case you have a TRFC mode of transfer. So it gets the maximum document number so that next time you have to process the source for BCI table, it looks for the document number greater than this document number stored. Then you have the parameter file, which could also be used, which contains information on IDOC number and folder. So you could generate the processing mapping for different data sources by going to the mappings tab and then clicking on generate BCA mapping. So you select the data source here, and go to next. Then you activate a data source in particular transfer mode. Because if you are sure your data source has IDA records greater than 1000 characters, then you may want to choose TRFC mode. If it is less than 1100 characters, then you can choose IDOC mode of transfer. Then you do an activate data source, which activates the ABAP extraction program for the particular data source in the SAP system. Then this is the window where you configure the data source to be extracted in a particular mode. Then select full update mode, which brings in all the data, or you could select delta, which creates a delta queue and pulls in only the data that has come to the delta queue. So before that, this uh, VC wizard gives you the option of generating the send request file. So for this data source, I'm going to say save send request file, generates a request file. A send request file typically looks like this. It has the data source name, it has the type of the update mode. Here it is F, if it is full, if it is D, it is delta, if it is C, it is delta with unit transfer. It also has the transfer mode. Here it is T, which is TRFC. It will be I if it is IDOC mode. So this is the send request file that will be used in the send request workflow. So once the send request file has been generated, now you can proceed to generate the mapping. Before that, let's take a look at the update mode here. Full update mode brings in the full data. Delta starts with delta init with transfer. The first time you run with delta init with transfer. Next time onwards, you run it with delta. There is an error when you start with delta repeat. So unlike an SAP BW system, we don't have the option for delta init without data transfer. So in case your data source contains huge amount of data, you may want to consider creating a delta with a particular filter condition, say for a particular data timeline. So when you configure delta, you'll have to initialize it. When you initialize it, it creates a delta initialization request and it sends this delta initialization request to the SAP system where the delta queue is created. You can also delete the delta queue from here and then recreate it again. So once this is done, you can have the generate mapping option here and you can generate the mapping for the next data source. Now let's take a look at the workflow configuration for these mappings. So let me start off with the simplest workflow here, the send request. The send request just needs a file reader connection. So you specify the source file name. We generated a send request file right now using the processing mapping. We give that name here, and then we give the source file directory. And once this is done, the send request workflow is configured. Then the processing workflow would be a simpler affair where um, you would configure it the same way as you would configure any other session. So let's move on to the listener session. Listener session has a couple of options which are meant for different purposes. So you will have three connections. One is an type R connection, which is for the listener. Then we have two other connections that were added in 9.1 HF4 and available as a EBF over 9.1 HF3. 9.1 HF5 onwards, all these options are available by default. So in for type R connection, you give a SAP ALE IDOC reader connection. Then you have a type A only connection, say SAP ALE IDOC writer, which is part of the BCA metadata connection. Then you have a relational connection, which is meant for a BCA lookup table. You may want to refer to the Power Exchange for SAP NetWeaver guide on how to create the BCA lookup table. So this BCA lookup table stores the information of request ID and the data source. The indicator table that I was referring to in the listener mapping is populated based on the data source name that is sent from the SAP. In case the data source extracts only 0 records, it doesn't give us the data source name. So we write the data source name to the BCA lookup table in our send request workflow. So let me take you back to the send request workflow. So in the send request target, you will have two connections. One will be the SAP ALE IDOC writer. Write a connection. Then there is one more connection which is relational, which I had shown there. It is meant for the BCA lookup table. So while I send request, I write the request ID and the data source name. So the connection that was added in the listener, the two new connections in HF4 versions onwards, was meant for this purpose. In case I get a data source with 0 records returned, I won't be able to find the data source name. So I would be able to read the data source name from the BCA lookup table rather and trigger the corresponding workflow. Then I had another connection which is SAP ALE IDOC writer, but that is an application connection or BCA metadata connection. BCA metadata connection is meant for the cases where we weren't able to read the IDOC read from the SAP if the IDOC segment exceeded 1000 characters. So that has been taken care in this. So sometimes your IDOC record can exceed more than 1100 characters for certain data sources. So the SAP system splits it based on the control record limit. The control record segment has a limit of 1061 or 101100. Um, so it will uh, cut the data at the 1061 limit and then it makes it as a new row of data. And this is populated in the source for BCA table. So you might see that for one IDOC record, the source for BCA table might have 2 rows. So these are the 3 connections that you need to configure in order to avail the fixes in the scenario where the data source does not return any records, and also in the case where your IDOC record exceeds 1000 characters. So we took a look at the different mappings and we saw how the scheduling works. Now we saw what different transfer methods entails. So if we have a TRFC mode, it is meant for all those data sources which has more than 1100 characters. Then IDOC mode is for those which are less than 1100 characters. Then we also saw the new functionalities that were added as part of a fix for cases where the SAP system does not return proper status when the data that is extracted is 0, and in cases where the character is greater than 1000 characters. So the connections that you have to use in the workflow are SAP ALE IDOC writer and SAP ALE IDOC reader for type R. So some of the suggestions are that if you migrate to the 9.1 HF4 or HF5 or above methods, then you will get all those functionalities that I had mentioned in this listener session. In order to avail that, you will also have to register a plugin called pmsappplg.xml, which would be discussed elaborately in the Power Exchange for SAP NetWeaver user guide. And one thing to note is it will be easier to debug the flow of data when you use IDOC transfer mode. And when you have to use TRFC transfer mode, then you can still account for the transactions that were issued from the SAP system. So I have given just a very brief outline on the BCF framework, and you may want to read the documentation to get more elaborate information. I hope this presentation was useful to you. Please send us your valuable feedback on supportvideos@informatica.com, or you can tweet us at support. Thank you.